today I'm talking about my book, Creative Control, The Ambivalence of Work in the Culture Industries. For the talk, I'm going to provide sort of an extended introduction and then focus on the distinctive form of alienation of creative workers. They experience what I call alienated judgment, and this occurs alongside immersive, affectively engaging or aesthetically enrolling work processes. Aesthetic enrollment and alienated judgment are parts of what I call the positive and negative poles of creative labor in the book. After I kind of go through that, I'll sum up, and I want to conclude with two provocations related to how the book's core argument might help us understand recent mobilizations among elite workers in the tech industry and the so-called great resignation that's going on with the pandemic, where a lot of people are resigning from jobs. Okay, so yeah, sorry, I just explained that. So in creative control, I'm basically asking the question, how is it that people come to be effectively invested in capitalism despite increasingly uncertain, precarious conditions of employment? To get at this big question, I focused on two cases of creative labor, or two organizational contexts in which people have to put forth creative labor. When I say creative labor, I mean everyday acts of interpretation, communication, action, and judgment using signs and symbols performed for a wage or in the service of profit making. Now, I'm borrowing that definition from Paul Willis. Some of you are probably certainly familiar with him, probably the book Learning to Labor. That definition comes from his later book, Common Culture, where he talks about symbolic work. Also for reference, what I'm calling creative labor is kind of similar to what someone like Richard Sennett might call character, or what Franco Berardi more provocatively calls the soul. Now, it's quite desirable to have a creative job that primarily requires creative labor. And if you're here today, you probably have that sort of job, or you aspire to, since you're involved in research, which is one of many fractions of what Richard Florida called the creative class. Creative class fractions also include workers in arts and cultural production, which is most of what I'm going to be talking about today, but also lawyers, architects, and workers in other kind of conventional professions, as well as educators and also tech sector employees rather. Now, a curious thing about these creative jobs is that they're on one hand highly desirable and potentially quite lucrative, but they're also highly uncertain in terms of employment conditions and earnings. So workers who perform creative labor also tend to be precariously employed, especially in the culture industries, where a few stars earn fortunes, but most workers take home lower than average wages, or more often nothing at all. So this book gets at this big question about capitalism. Why is it still kind of so effectively appealing to people? By asking two much more manageable questions about creative labor processes. First, and this is kind of following in the labor process tradition in labor sociology, how do organizations control creative labor? I don't know about you, but a lot of people I've encountered while doing this research tend to think of creativity as quite free or beyond control, yet labor of any kind, as any good sociologist knows, tends to always be subject to control strategies implemented by organizations. So how is it that organizations control creative labor, and how does this vary between conventional and platformized contexts is kind of what I get at in the book. Second, how is it that workers come to be effectively attached to precarious conditions of employment? In a way, these two interrelated questions are variants of what is a quite classic question in labor sociology, which is basically like, why is it that people work so hard, right? Or put differently, how does the labor process elicit consent to managerial or capitalist hegemony? That's kind of a more conceptual way of saying it. Now, my argument is that creative labor processes don't elicit consent so much as they temporarily enroll workers in organizational projects through a series of managerial invitations. And these managerial invitations depend upon specific materialities or organizational aesthetics. So aesthetic enrollment and these managerial invitations comprise what I call creative labor's positive pole, or the pleasures of work that make what Angela McRobbie calls the controlling discourse of creativity feel true. So, to kind of give you a little bit more background of where I'm kind of coming from. So, studies commonly find that culture workers love or enjoy their work, even if they lack stable incomes and all the protections that tend to come with standard employment. Some of us social scientists might be inclined to cynically interpret that finding and say it's just a rationalization or it's kind of a trivial ideological gloss. But for me, I try to take people seriously when they say that I love my work or I really enjoy my job. And then to go one step beyond that and say, well, how is it that they come to feel that way? In doing so, I find a much more complicated and altogether more multivalent picture, one in which enjoyment coincides with alienation. Now, current explanations of creative labor's core ambivalence tend to be predicated upon a more rational, kind of calculative individual, one for whom the opportunity to, be creative functions as a fair trade-off, a psychic wage that replaces stinging financial burdens and ultimately motivates workers to supply their creative labor to employers. However, my findings consistently demanded a more embodied explanation, one that could not be contained by, economic reductionism. So another explanation common to both economists and sociologists focuses on normative control or ideology. And this is what certain Bourdieuian influence scholars might call the illusio or of the field of cultural production. So proponents of this explanation claim that for art's sake, ideology motivates culture workers to pursue status or symbolic rewards rather than purely economic gains. In this explanation, the weight of reputation and the disciplining whip of radically uncertain labor markets control labor rather than management or capital. Similarly, research in the labor process tradition tends to focus on ideology or normative control when talking about creative labor or knowledge workers. This tradition, as some of you I'm sure draws inspiration from Marx or Harry Braverman, kind of Michael Burroy, that style of explanation. There's been a strong focus on explaining, in that tradition, how it is that capital exerts power over labor during the working day. Now, in both of these explanations, whether we're talking about the illusio or ideology, belief kind of explains both why people work so hard for so little, which I would call control, as well as their persistence in uncertain careers, or what I would call attachment. Early in the book, I show concretely how this ideology or illusion appears much too fragmented and too conflicted along lines of class to fully explain why it is that creative workers put forth so much effort despite the uncertain conditions of their employment. The limit of ideology as an explanation becomes apparent when we endeavor to explain what actually binds people to their beliefs. And I think this is the contribution here to cultural sociology, which is asking how is it that workers come to be effectively attached to this precarious form of employment. In the book, I show how workers in the culture industries often feel deeply attached to their labor processes, but they also report a distinct type of alienation vis-a-vis their products, often likening the fruits of their labor to trash, garbage, or even excrement. In the same breath, they describe embodied pleasures derived from being creative, often pointing back to sense experiences in relation to technologies. And so, because of that, I turn toward organizational aesthetics research, affect theory, and Alfred Gell's theorization of aesthetic objects as technologies of enchantment. He's an anthropologist, so just to give you a little bit of background, for Gell, aesthetic objects, so art, media, music, etc., mediate social relationships and exert power over us by virtue of our fascination or our ability to figuratively disappear into them as we search for meaning. This constitutes the magic that an object might have over us, and to disappear into or merge with an object, this is the kind of language frequently used by my informants when talking about technology, To do so is to have what a range of philosophers and social scientists from Gell to Adorno to John Dewey describe as an aesthetic experience. So I argue that contemporary work technologies afford the possibility of aesthetic experiences, enchanting the labor process as workers disappear into these technologies, often in search of meaning. No longer appendages to disenchanting machines of mass production or subordinates to a bureaucracy, creative workers appear enchanted by the machines that enable and extend their ability to perform creative labor. Now, I'm presenting technology as part of the material embodied experience of work, one that both enchants and enables work to be done. The book, I think, provides a more full bodied and ultimately more satisfactory answer to the question of how workers become so deeply attached to precarious employment. As I argue, explaining creative labor's attachment to precarity by pointing only to ideology provides an incomplete, disembodied answer. In contrast, I argue that this ideology depends upon distinctive, often technological aesthetics or materialities found in creative workplaces. The objects or artifacts that enable and extend creative labor provide a bit of magic or ineffable cool, a distinctive structure of feeling that binds workers to their work. Now, in discussing how organizational aesthetics and materiality shape how work feels, I'm also engaging with what scholars in critical sociology and cultural studies call affect theory. Here, a diverse array of theorists define affect as our ability to affect and be affected through non discursive forms of meaning caused by a variety of sensory impingements upon the body, not quite emotion, but a feeling, a vibe, as people often say these days. This resembles how organizational scholars define aesthetics, or what is, quote, what is thought and felt by the body's sensory and perceptive faculties in relation to objects. Now, a key assertion from Brian Masumi, who is one of affect theory's leading voices, has been that these embodied meanings lie below the level of discourse and supposedly beyond ideology. As such, affect supposedly provides an outside from which one might resist dominant and dominating meanings, and thus a basis for political mobilization or politics of affect. In the book, I describe a more ambivalent situation, one where aesthetics or sense experiences vis-a-vis objects enroll workers in capitalist projects of profit making. Repeated interactions with technology make precarious work sensually enjoyable, binding workers to their work. So rather than positing the affective or aesthetic dimension of social life as a sort of asocial wellspring of resistance unbridled by ideology or discursive qualification, I'm arguing that affect or aesthetics may lead us down the path of consent to domination just as much as these felt experiences might nudge us towards refusal. Affect and aesthetics provide a basis for power to act upon us just as much as a bedrock upon which resistance might be built. My contribution here lies in bringing these discussions into the sociology of work, while also standing alongside recent critiques of affect theory in related disciplines like cultural studies and anthropology by highlighting how the aesthetic dimension of social life provides a basis for the exertion of capitalist power over workers. So I'm sure, us being all very astute sociologists are thinking, well, that's all well and good, but where how are you able to make these theoretical assertions, right? The book is a comparative ethnographic study of creative labor in conventional and platformized cultural production organizations. So I based this theoretical narrative on 20 months of extensive participant observation and interviews that I conducted from 2013 through 2018, when I worked alongside and shadowed freelance recording engineers and office staff at an LA recording studio that I call Sonico. And I also worked alongside office staff at an organization that I call The Future. The Future manages YouTube content producers who are located around the world. After about 10 months at The Future, I then through funds from the National Science Foundation, was able to travel across the US to interview some of those content producers in their home production studios. So alongside my participant observation, I conducted 84 semi-structured in-depth interviews with managers, workers, and even some technology designers. And I also conducted a field survey of employees at the future since it was kind of a larger firm. Um, and then I also did some created some audio field recordings to try and get it kind of capture some elements of the sense experience of the spaces in which these people work. I also attended the industry check of of VidCon in 2015 and 2018, which is an annual industry conference and fan convention. It's held in Anaheim, California. So basically, there's like a lower level where teenagers come to get their get materials of like YouTubers autograph stuff, but then there's the upper level where all these like CEOs basically plot how to get those teenagers eyeballs glued to screens. It's kind of a bizarre convention. Anyway, so I'm happy to talk about like demographics of interviews and things like that later if you have questions about that. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to talk a bit about wages before going on to highlight the purpose of this comparison. So office staff at the recording studio at Sonico earned about $20,000 to $25,000 a year. That's for like a 40 to 50-hour work week without benefits of any kind. And then recording engineers fared a bit better, earning an average of $35,000 a year, although that was quite a range from that to people kind of earning the low of six figures. Office staff at the future also earn close to the US median income of about $35,000 per year, but content producers' earnings range from zero to well into the six-figure range. So just to be clear, these were either low-paying jobs or, in the case of recording engineers and YouTubers, they were highly uncertain jobs. Okay, so to be clear, this is not an occupational comparison. It's a comparison of creative labor across two divergent organizational contexts. So through the comparison, I'm trying to draw out similarities between the two cases to develop a more empirically grounded theory of creative labor. To do so, I selected a fairly conventional mode of organizing creative labor, which is a recording studio, basically the same kind of organizational form as existed more or less since the 1970s. I mean, there's been slight alterations, but it's a fairly conventional mode of organizing that kind of work. And then a relatively new mode of organizing creative labor, one that depends upon a particular social media platform. Now, I leveraged this comparison to both develop a kind of a generic theory of creative labor processes, as well as to explain how the platformization of work shapes creative labor. At first glance, these might seem like two very different sites, and of course they are. Each company has a very different business model and a very different organizational structure. Yet jobs in these organizations require the same sort of labor, creative labor, and that's the point of comparison. So despite their differences, they end up being quite similar in terms of key concepts in the study of labor. So organizational control, alienation, and resistance, or in this case, lack thereof. Okay, so that's a lot of information that I just threw at you. And based on that, I'm just gonna kind of descend down to like a smaller portion of that larger kind of book. In today's talk, I just want to focus on the one component or one valence of what I'm calling creative labor's negative pole. And I'm going to talk about alienation. So I don't know about you, but like I said before, when I started doing this research and consistently throughout, people and myself, kind of naively thought of creativity or being creative rather, as the opposite of alienated labor. This is certainly the image one finds if you go through the last century of labor research, and certainly the case if you examine various critical thinkers on the topic. Creativity is often presumed to be the opposite of subordination or even resistant. That said, as one digs into the research on creative industries or culture industries, you find that people are anything but emancipated, anything but self-actualized, so much so that we've been told for a while now that alienation takes on a greater significance among creative, cognitive, or immature aerial workers, perhaps even more so than it did among the sorts of workers described by 19th and 20th century analyses put forth from, say, Marx or Harry Braverman. So, for example, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri in their path-breaking book Multitude from about, when was it, like 17, 18 years ago, claim that in knowledge production and symbolic production, alienation does provide a useful conceptual key for understanding exploitation. But they never really state what it is that creative labor processes alienate. That kind of leaves an open question. So, according to Franco Berardi, who I mentioned earlier in his book, The Soul at Work, overabsorption and overstimulation are the overstimulation of our senses, rather, are the alienation of our times. He argues that cognitive capitalism alienates our affect, what he calls the soul, or the sensibility animating the body. Cognitive capitalism, according to Berardi, alienates our affects while capturing value from cognition and communication, for example, creative labor. Assuming workers to be affectively alienated, Berardi argues that judgment, reason, or ethical consciousness cannot form a basis for the political mobilization of contemporary labor. Instead, he argues opposition to contemporary capitalism must be founded upon an aesthetic paradigm, since it must take root in sensibility or affect. This is a theorization shared by the affect theorists I mentioned earlier, most notably Brian Masumi. In contrast to Berardi and other speculative critical theorists, my work and other empirical research shows workers engaged by their work, caught in the flow, or as I write in the book, aesthetically enrolled by work processes. Now, far from alienated by workplace affects, workers' sensibilities often appear highly attuned to the demands of sensorially and often technologically dense work processes. Put different, the labor process dominates at the level of affect and aesthetics. Power operates by inviting workers and engaging them aesthetically, sensually, or effectively. This runs rough against critical theorists who argue for a politics of affect while also provoking, I think, a really serious question for labor scholars. How does one organize workers against dynamic and exciting yet exploitative work? What is to borrow from Mario Tronti, what is the alienation that must be organized? And as I show, creative labor processes alienate workers' judgment. Okay, so what do I mean by this? What does it look like? Finally, we're going to get to some actual people doing and saying stuff, right? So what does this look like? Well, I want to start with an example from the recording studio. So we're going to look at someone in a more kind of expressive job, recording engineer. And you might say, well, what the heck does a recording engineer do? Well, they operate the equipment used to record music in a recording studio, some of which you should hopefully be able to see on the screen here. This requires judgments to be made about obtaining an accurate or a stylized representation of the music being performed. So engineers' input in cultural production, of course, ranges from lowly assistant engineers who basically just do what they're told by musicians to engineer producers who actively shape the songs being made. And I spoke with an equal number of engineers who performed both roles and sat in on a number of sessions and kind of, would hang out with them in between sessions while they're just hanging around the studio. Technology is a core component of the kind of work they do, as various production technologies enable engineers to deploy and also extend their creative capabilities. Some even refer to technology, or what they call gear, as the quote porn side of the job that elicits quote lust, and the part of the job that quote does not feel like work. So they like being creative, they like new technologies. They also enjoyed using their expertise to make judgments about the sounds of songs, often attempting to ensure that they had the final say over things like microphone placements or the final mixes of a song. So for example, one day, Thomas, who is a recording engineer at Sonico in the book, explained to a person I call Emmerich, who's the studio's head engineer. Thomas was explaining to Emmerich that a musician might want to sit in the room while they mixed and edited her songs. Thomas said, I told her to just trust us, that you're really good. And Emmerich said, oh, you're making me blush. Now, why do I tell you this? Well, what I'm trying to highlight as the story unfolds, I'll kind of explain a little bit better. But what I want to highlight here is they like being in control. They like making judgments about sound. But what did they dislike about the job? What did they find alienating about work? Well, as they went on to discuss in that same conversation, they went on to discuss what they thought of as a problem of having clients in the room while they edited and mixed songs. I hate that. It's just like, let me do my work. Let me do what works. Oh, this part isn't doing anything in this song. Well, delete. This imagined conflict that Emmerich hates, it's a conflict of status, sure. It's about who gets to make that choice, but it's also a conflict of judgment. Which valuation of sound, which preference wins out? These sorts of conflicts arise in the studio all the time, pretty much in every session. And most of the time, the end result, the song that you end up hearing on the radio or whatever, is the result of the push and pull of these conflicts as each party kind of attempts to establish authority over sound. Sometimes engineers wash their hands of the situation entirely, accepting the authority of musicians. This was the case in a live performance that I was working at, where one of Sonoco's engineers ran live sound for some performing artists. So on that gig, when I was working with someone I called Jerry, in the book, he had set the sound levels for the performance as best he could, and then the musicians came behind the soundboard where he was working and sort of mucked up the levels of the microphones because they thought they wanted to have a say in how they sounded. This caused ear-piercing feedback almost immediately that the musicians really couldn't fix on their own. And so then they would ask Jerry to fix the situation. This repeated several times over the course of several hours, like a lengthy, kind of arduous sound check. As Jerry said, doing these events are usually a big pain in the ass, but this one here really takes the cake. Essentially, the musicians were asserting their agency and contested Jerry's judgment, which led him to disavow his contribution to the performance. As he said, I just let them do their thing, and if they make it sound crappy, what do I care? It's not my name on this. Now, in these two instances, engineers' judgments were invited, they're kind of required, but in a fairly limited capacity, mostly subordinate to their clients. As another engineer said, that's what the money's for. Unless they're trying to haggle me into doing something for next to nothing, it's like people are paying not to be told they suck and not to be told to go take a hike. Okay. So that was, one example from the studio. Now I want to compare engineers' relationship to music to people who were the office staff at the studio. At Sonoco, as you can imagine, music is all over the place. It's a recording studio, right? Music plays over the office stereo. Music booms out from behind the doors of the rehearsal and recording rooms in the studio at nearly 100 decibels. Just to give you a sense, that's the equivalent of a garbage truck or a machinist's shop floor. So it's pretty loud. While office staff frequently said that they loved their job because they could, quote, be creative in how they accomplished office tasks, they also claimed that work had made them enjoy music less. As one of them said, let me get the quote up on the screen for you. As one of them said, it's like if you work at a hot dog restaurant, you don't want to eat hot dogs when you're at home. When you're surrounded by a product all day long, it's nice to get a break from the product, including, in my case, music. It's nice to just not hear it or think about it when I'm at home. Now, another claimed that the abundant, relentlessly loud music at work altered his taste, lessening his interest in rock music, leading him to prefer silence. On an especially slow day at the studio, some electronic dance music came on over the office stereo system in the lobby. Jeff, who is an office worker, turned off the stereo rather, and said, "This music sucks. That's why I don't play the company's internet radio station." One of the owners said that I could do my own radio show. Again, you see this kind of invitation from management to participate. And they said I could play whatever I wanted, but you need all the MP3s for that. And I don't have an extensive music collection. I just use Spotify. No one listens to this anyway. Here he's lacking the materials needed to accept his manager's invitation to express himself. But even so, Jeff exerted agency through simple refusal. Just as he finished complaining, one of the owners walked in and politely asked, "Hey, why isn't the internet radio on in the lobby?" Jeff tapped at the iPad that controlled the radio and said, "It's on, should be on." After the manager left, Jeff explained that he already had to hear enough music he did not like, and so sometimes he forgot to turn on the stereo. Perhaps this is an act of, passive resistance. And so by simply preferring not to, Jeff asserted his taste, which is, after all, a matter of judgment. Okay, so I want to compare this to YouTubers. And here's an image of a young woman I met while traveling around the US interviewing YouTubers. She makes content out of her grandmother's living room, and that helps pay for her college tuition. There's a lot of interesting stories like that, and interesting ways in which people use the platform to make ends meet. Anyway, so focusing on this issue of alienation. So unlike engineers, YouTubers tend to produce for the platform and its audiences rather than in the service of clients. Though sometimes they also do that. So just like Sonoco's workers, content producers enjoyed being creative, which included what they described as the electric thrill of chasing views and a generalized desire and excitement for technology. The platform, which is to say infrastructure, tends to replace the client in platformized production. Organizations like the one where I did fieldwork also mediate that relationship. So, person that I call Becky, who is a wine enthusiast and lifestyle vlogger, illustrated this particular socio-technical structure of alienated judgment very clearly when she described her most popular videos. She often gets requests from fans to produce content that they want to see. Doing so increases her engagement metrics, so things like comments, likes, things like that, shares on the platform, and which increases her and the future's ad revenues, or at least it can potentially, often does. Becky described the situation as follows. She said, I'm just like, ew, I don't want to do that, but then I'll just do it. She went on to elaborate, saying, I just want to have quality content that's entertaining and informative. And I'm not trying to get a viral YouTube video, although my manager would like to have one. You can't go in thinking, I'm going to make a viral video. Now, a lot of my most watched videos are ones that are just kind of dumb, like my drunk dating advice or my haul videos where I go to a store and get a bunch of stuff and drink it and give my opinions on camera. Those aren't even informative. Now, you might say, okay, well, that's not the platform, that's her audience. And you wouldn't be wrong in saying that, but it would be incomplete. You need to consider that the platform's interface mediates Becky's interactions with her fans. And so she doesn't orient to people so much as she interacts with a combination of human and non-human actors. It's this assemblage of infrastructure and humans that guide her production practices, leading her to produce content that she finds distasteful, most especially when she orients toward engagement metrics and fan suggestions. Now, this subordination to the platform is mediated by management companies like The Future. Now, despite diversity in The Future's office and diversity in its roster of creators, the company's upper level management and executive staff were overwhelmingly white, middle-aged, heteronormatively masculine men. Should come as no surprise that given this hierarchy, the company tended to favor all the sorts of things that the conventional, Hollywood film industry tends to favor. And they tended to offer more opportunities to what I think it's safe to say we would all consider to be sexist and often racist content produced by white men. And they favored that over and above content produced by people of color, women, and LGBTQ creators. So in addition to platforms' algorithms, downstream organizations such as The Future reproduce inequalities along intersecting lines of race, gender, and sexuality. This reproduction of that sort of those that decision-making structure also led to office staff at The Future feeling quite alienated by that which they work to promote. They referred to many of The Future's top creators as trash, garbage, racist, sexist garbage, or quote, turds at the bottom of the trough. Now, that last one might seem a bit strange in that it kind of mixes metaphors, but it makes sense if you understand that, like, a lot of the people who worked at The Future referred to their work as, quote, slopping the trough. So one of the trough sloppers, who I call Laura in the book, she really liked her job. She really was really enthusiastic in saying that. And what she did was she edited video for the Future's promotional reels, or what she calls sizzle reels in the quotation that should be on screen. They use these to basically promote their roster of creators at industry trade shows. She found the work immersive. It felt good to do the work. But when I asked her what she disliked, she said, well, the opposite is a lot of our channels are absolute garbage. A lot of the talent is garbage. The pranks are garbage, misogynist, racist garbage, actual garbage. I had to cut a sizzle, which is a promotional kind of montage video, for some prank channels. These are the channels in which people kind of go outside and conduct pranks. They're usually quite problematic, to say the least. And it was the worst thing. Even another channel, I hate them. I generally hate a lot of the talent and don't want them to be successful. So there's that. I have to cut sizzles for stuff that's garbage that I think shouldn't exist. So there's that. And she kind of said this with a sense of humor, but she really was not a fan of this stuff. Likewise, Leo, who's another trough slopper, enjoyed providing tips to creators on how to kind of game the algorithm. That was his job at this kind of digital talent management company. But he said, most of the stuff we do is garbage. It's garbage. The really popular vlogger, which is a video blogger, I didn't know who he was before I came here. Most of this stuff, I don't know who that is. It's some guy talking about his life. What do I care? I hate that. And pranks, man, that's crap too. Yeah, some of those are funny, but it's all mean-spirited. It's just going into public and messing with people or provoking men. For those of you who don't know, there's a whole genre of YouTube pranks that basically people go and engage in what we might call breaching experiments. And they're usually, again, quite problematic, but they get a lot of views. So you go out and they're in public and provoking men, or they're like, it's a social experiment. Okay, you piss someone off by being weird, and then you say, oh, it really makes you think. What were they trying to make you think about? I mean, seriously. Like creators, the office staff's judgment tended to be subordinated to the platform's metrics as mediated by an organizational hierarchy that supports racist and sexist content. Workers often enjoyed their work processes, yet the content they helped produce confronted them as excrement or trash. So in both of these cases, I think you can see that people, in both cases, people are kind of aesthetically enrolled or kind of like affectively attached to their job. And this often occurred vis-a-vis interactions with technologies. But alongside these moments of immersion, they experience what I'm calling alienated judgment. Despite this similarity, there's at least one crucial difference between the future and Sonico, which stems from the future's embeddedness within a particular platform. So while the judgment of Sonico's workers was subordinated by means of social relationships or social interactions with clients, the future's creators and office staff tended to be subordinate to infrastructure as mediated by organizational hierarchy. So rather than orienting toward clients, the future's creators and office staff tended to orient to the platform's algorithms and metrics, often quantifying the value of their creative labor in a way that differs from the more socially embedded situation at Sonico. This structural difference links workers' alienation directly to infrastructure owned and operated by global capital, as creators' metric-based decision-making serves the pecuniary interests of capital, in this case, Google's YouTube, as well as the future. But not necessarily the aesthetic interests of workers. As such, workers were alienated from their taste, which is a type of judgment. So some of the key books they show in the book is that workers' alienation and affective attachment to work neither reconcile in the form of a uncritical consent to managerial or capitalist hegemony, nor do they erupt in collective resistance. Instead, they hang in a sort of constant, delicate tension. When out of balance, workers tend to engage in passive individual acts of resistance, followed by exit. And they do this rather than engage in some sort of collective organization against their bosses or the platform. Creative labor tends to be managed loosely, with managerial authority depending on neither prescription nor prohibition, but instead invitation. Workers' acceptance of the managerial invitation requires modulation of work's affective and aesthetic dimensions. Management in the platform may invite creativity, but the material experience of the working day enables workers to accept that invitation. Work's materiality and the associated embodied experiences bind creative labor to the labor process. Upon reflection, workers find the products of their labor to be distasteful. In these cases, capital creatively controls labor, while labor lacks creative control. Now, I want to conclude with two speculative provocations. First, this alienation, I think, provides for a shared politics, labor politics, among fractions of the creative classes, from the high-paid content producers to lowly content moderators described in recent books like The Custodians of the Internet and Behind the Screen, to people engaged in these kind of like office work situations that I've described. Recent events highlight this possibility for a shared politics of judgment. For example, well-paid tech workers in Silicon Valley's effectively and aesthetically engaging offices formed a minority union in 2021. They did so for reasons quite specifically to do with ethical judgment, or as they said, to examine Google's role in society, specifically whether or not YouTube will continue to function as a vector for the growth of fascist movements if it persists in prioritizing advertisers. Similarly, nearly 5,000 Google employees signed a petition against a military contract known as Project Maven, which pressured the tech giant to cancel the contract. Employees hope to advance a, quote, strong ethical framework that values human life and safety as separate from positive or as inseparable, rather, from positive technological progress. And quite clearly, these are examples of a politics of judgment or opposition predicated upon reasoned disdain for capital's interests rather than a politics of affect. The high-paid Google employees struggle for control over how to stay true to their ethics, just as low-paid workers in the future struggle to reconcile their opposition to racism and sexism with the, quote, garbage that they doled out to social media users. Now, second, as I said, controlling creative labor depends upon workplace materialities, or what I call work's aesthetic dimension. While the pandemic continues to expose service workers and others to untold dangers, the more fortunate among us experience a disruption of work's materialities. I kind of go into this in my own kind of personal experience of this in a recent issue of ASA's Footnotes that came out a couple days ago. So if you want a fun kind of more essay-like story, you can check that out there. Anyway, working remotely alters our sensory experiences of work and the social dynamics of work. It kind of strips away many of the moments during the working day that enroll us in organizational projects. My book suggests that this disruption may lead workers to exit from alienating and precarious jobs. When given space for reflection, alienation becomes apparent, and when extricated from aesthetically enrolling work processes, workers will, at least hypothetically, exit. So from my vantage point, that seems to be exactly what we're seeing in the so-called Great Resignation, where you see a lot of people resigning from jobs in the current moment. Now, given time to reflect upon their situations rather than remaining deeply enmeshed in work processes, we are seeing a lot of people kind of leaving their jobs. So with that, I want to conclude and just say thank you again for having me. And I'm really excited to hear any questions you might have. And also, there's a little discount code there too. If you're interested in purchasing the book, you can get 20% off through Columbia University Press. So yeah, so thank you so much.